Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to the grid. I'm Joel, aka the Blur Grammar, and this is a breakdown of all the things Kang in terms of the comics. If you've only read, or I should say seen, MCU movies at this point and you've never read comics ever before, this is the series that you want to stick around for, because if again there is a lot that we could talk about with Kang if you've never heard or seen any of his comic variants before, and you've only seen him inside of the MCU, in at least at this point inside of Loki. If you've only understood what he is or who he is by the characterization of who he remains, this is the series that you want to pay attention to, because I'm going to go through as much as granulated possibly I can. What am I trying to say? As much as I possibly can right now. I'm going to go through all of the facets of Kang inside of a series. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but I'm going to go through everything that I possibly know about Kang inside of this video series. So stick around, grab a like. Okay, so let's get started. For comparison, and just as a side note, I'm going to be using this as my definition for all the things that are going to happen in terms of what I'm going to talk about inside this video in terms of Kang. And if you've never read that comic, you probably want to pick that up, because again, that's where I'm going to reference a good portion of everything inside of this series that we're going to talk about in the unpacking of who Kang really is. So depending on where you pick up with Kang inside of the timeline in terms of the comics in general, you could probably see him first as his very first edition in terms of who he would potentially become in the rest of the years of Marvel Comics, and specifically inside of Fantastic Four. Yes, he actually appeared inside of comics for the very first time inside of Fantastic Four comics, but in this video series we are going to talk about who he is as a whole, based on the epic collection that is pertaining specifically and solely towards him. Hey, my friend, how you doing? Hey, come closer. Come on, come closer. Come on. Back up. That's right. There. Are you having a good time? Are you enjoying yourself right now? Are you learning something that you didn't know about Kang in the comics before? If you've never ever read any of the comics, or literally just been watching MCU movies basically for the entirety of the MCU, I invite you to like this video right now, because what I want to do is spread all of this comic goodness and all this knowledge and everything to the entire YouTube world. And I need your help to do that. So please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and also go ahead and like this video. Thank you. Let's get back to it. So in the version that we're talking about here, we start with a depiction of Nathaniel Richards as a 16 to 18-year-old kid. After this, or we pick up at this point with Nathaniel actually seeing or talking to himself in the 31st century, as he is just recovering from a slit throat from bullies. And at this point, we are now in a utopian type of environment, because everything can be healed or cured. Whatever it is, whatever ailment you have, you can basically cure it. And this is what practically makes Nathaniel Richards very, very perturbed with his current situation. As a person that literally lives in the future, he thinks that the future is very much boring and decides he wants to go back to Iron Fist and chaos magic, or mysterious magic as it happens inside the comics, but I'm inferring this is relating to Wanda and all those other things in the past. What he wants to do is to go back in time and to look at things that happened before his current living environment, because he believes that the future is completely barren in terms of action and anything in the way of understanding or learning new things, because everything has already been conquered at this point. So he goes back in time in search of something that he can latch his teeth onto, and he finds a version of Victor Von Doom's Doombots at this point. In the encounter with the Doombot, he then sees, or at least unbeknownst to him, a version of himself in the future, and asks a very troubling question to the future portion of himself, which the banter between the two is pretty hilarious. The future Kang responds to Nathaniel Richards at this point, who is again a teenager, and basically tells him that you haven't seen everything that there is to see, or at least I've seen everything that there is to see, and I will probably see it again and will continue to see it. And I am you, but I am also me at the same time. Or should I say he says to him that I am you or I was you in the beginning and you become me in the end. We then fast forward to Kang showing Nathaniel how to shoot, kill, doing all kinds of nefarious different things, but specifically bringing him into a portion of the timeline which is 65 million BCE, before the asteroid hits the Earth in this particular point of the timeline. This is basically when we start to see that Kang is grooming Nathaniel to become him in the end, but we also start to see differences in the way that Kang looks at things in terms of his time travel and things that have happened over his life, and what Nathaniel has known over the course of his 18 years or so, which in his time, Nathaniel specifically speaking here, everything was a utopian world. So any type of contact, none of it actually happened. The entire world was completely sterile, pretty much, and especially after he had his own run-in with an incident with his own health, having his throat slit, and then recovering from that. Basically, in this utopian world, you can have your throat slit and then recover from that type of an injury. Basically saying that this could go on and on and on and on if we wanted to, because of the way that Nathaniel actually grew up. So when Kang demonstrates his demeanor or how things are supposed to go and the way that he tells him to go, he instructs him specifically to never fall in love. The reason being is because it is the only thing, at least in terms of the way that Kang looks at this, it's the only thing that makes you weak and then makes you susceptible to annihilation. During his training, Kang shows Nathaniel the many different facets of the timeline that he has encountered, and basically the first time that he encountered the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and everything else, all of it inside of his own unique vision of his time and his timeline through time and space. But in that same scenario inside the comic, we then see the words that Nathaniel was given, never to fall in love, not followed very quickly after that. So I want to take a quick pause here to talk a little bit about this specific section of Kang's character, both Nathaniel Richards and Kang himself, Kang the Conqueror in this case. Everything in terms of this moment regarding Kang in general feels like the catalyst of why he is always chasing, and we see that inside the comics, he's always chasing the former or latter portion of himself, or even the future portion of himself, because of the fact of love. So going as a quick segue into the next part of the comic, going into where Nathaniel reaches the first point of his encounter with love, he sees a almost Amazonian type of woman going against a T-Rex at this point. And when he sees that, what's going on in his mind is, I've never seen another, he's seen other people, but he's never touched another person ever. Because again, in his world, it's a completely utopian world. It's completely sterile and nobody touches anybody physically. So because of this, he now sees a beautiful woman, and then after saving her, he literally jumps right into action, saves her, and then they become close. They establish the fact that they have a common language also. And when he decides that he's going to break the fourth wall, so to speak, in terms of his connection with other people, he actually has physical contact for the very first time, or at least maybe very first time, or a very long time before this actually happened. The comic never really says if he ever has any physical contact before his whole incident with his throat getting slit and all that kind of stuff. But in this particular comic, it doesn't say that. It just says that he's never touched anyone, or at least in this sphere of his life, he hasn't had physical contact in a very long time. So when he does, it instantly starts something for him and basically catapults him into love. And he actually goes back after spending time with the people in the village king, or the village head, basically gives him a stamp of approval for everyone in the village also. And when he gets back to Kang already knows what happened. In turn, in knowing everything that is going on, and this is a point that I was trying to make earlier, his whole point of not falling in love is also tied to a person that he comes into contact with, which we actually see later on in the comics. But he comes into contact with a woman called, or named, Ravonna. And every time that he hears this voice, he completely loses it, basically to the point where he drinks himself into a stupor, doesn't even know what the heck is going on, and then becomes just a vegetable pretty much, which leads into his demise later on. But in this whole situation, all of it's going on and everything is up and down and up and down and up and down. But when Kang realizes that Nathaniel has now become susceptible or compromised by love, he literally loses it. And not to the point where, you just drinks himself to a stupor. No. He loses everything and then takes his weaponry and decides that he's going to annihilate the entire village from existence. So going back to a previous conversation between Nathaniel and, I believe her name is Ari, but fact check me if you in the comics, in the comments if you know that specifically, if you read this comic. But in that conversation, she says that there was a asteroid or a rock that basically gave them existence, and there's going to be a rock that's going to take existence from them. But that's not exactly what happens when it comes to Kang. And in that conversation between Nathaniel and Ari, and again, I'm just using her name because that's what I remember. In that conversation, basically she tells him that there's no real reason to worry about the fact that that's going to happen. That's the beauty of having life in general. But Nathaniel doesn't understand that because he's a time traveler. Inside of his character, both Kang and Nathaniel Richards are time travelers by nature. So by the sheer cosmos, I guess, everything that they do is in the sphere of how can I change this outlook, or how do I grab this by the horns and actually make it do what I want. So Nathaniel doesn't understand that. And when he comes back to Kang again realizes that if he doesn't do something now, it's going to change or annihilate both him and Nathaniel, probably in swift succession. So he takes into his own hands, deciding to then destroy the entire village, including the woman that Nathaniel now loves. When that now happens, you now see the difference between Kang and Nathaniel come full circle here. But it's also the same parallel that you see between the both of them, because love is the catalyst for everything that they're doing. So at the end of this portion of the comic, and again, this is a 4-part series, I believe. At the end of this comic, or the beginning of this first comic series, or the beginning of this first book, I should say, he basically then is like, I'm just going to understand that Kang has this flaw. And the flaw is every time that he hears Ravonna's name, he again loses it. When he does that, he goes into a stupor, drinking himself almost to death pretty much. And in this case, it actually is, because Nathaniel takes the suit from Kang, while the asteroid is hurling to the Earth at this moment, and modifies it to fit his body so that he can then jump to a different timeline. As he's doing that, he's basically saying that this is how I'm going to defeat this version of Kang. So this is how Kang in this particular situation, and possibly all of the Kangs in general in the comics, are annihilated because of the fact that they are susceptible, or he is susceptible, to love in some form or fashion. And when he encounters it, he cannot run away from it as much as he possibly wants to. And when he does try and run away from it, it actually backfires on him. So this is why I was theorizing in the previous video about the two Kangs. And if you haven't seen that video, please go ahead and watch it here. But if this is the main reason why I was theorizing about that, and probably why a lot of people are in general, because Kang, if you look at his body of charactership, if that's even a word, if you look at that, it's basically two different types of Kangs going up against each other, at least in the way that this story is being told. So we'll talk about more of it in the second part of this series. But when we get to the second part of this comic series, basically what we see is everything coming into a head, and then ending with, or at least this first book ends with, Nathaniel going into ancient Egypt and encountering Ramatut for the very first time, which is another version of Kang. So again, we'll talk more about that in the second part of this series. But right now, what I really want to drive home is this is what I really believe, or why I really believe, that we will probably have two Kangs inside of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, because of the fact that literally everything in terms of Kang, or in terms of how he views the world based on the comics, I should say, is more or less geared towards either finding love or completely staying well away from it. Okay, so again, I'm thinking that this is going to be a 4-part series. I didn't know in the beginning of this video, but as I'm talking through this, I think this is going to be a 4-part series. But if you've never read any of the comics in terms of knowing when Kang even starts, and by the way, he is actually inside of Fantastic Four comics, but again, that's in a separate video. We'll talk about that later. But if you learned something, and if you like this video, you know what I need you to do. Hit the like button, and then go ahead and subscribe to this channel, because I'm going to be doing stuff like this all next year. So if you want to know about how comics intertwine with each other, and how all of that intertwines with the MCU, and then how all of that intertwines with all of that inside of one big old package on a subscription. If you want YouTube to give you that on a regular basis, that's what you need to do, and subscribe right now, because what else? It's free. What else is there to do? Anyway, and until next video, blurred out.